Thanks for joining me today for a milestone episode 50 of Podcasting Your Brand. I'm your host, producer Jemmy, providing learning lessons for you to podcast your brand. And today, I'm going to share a podcasting 101 topic, content prep for your interviews. This episode is brought to you by my own brand, Flintstone Media. Listen in and let's do this. So on the last episode, episode 49, we talked about prepping for your guests, finding them, approaching them, scheduling them, all that good stuff. And today we're going to be focusing on the content prep for your interviews. So there are so many different approaches for preparing to interview a guest, probably as many approaches as there are podcasters, really. So in other words, take the advice you're about to hear and mold it to fit your needs, because I'm going to run through the process that I take. And I actually really enjoy researching my guests. And in my opinion, if you're a podcaster who really wants to be great, you have to figure out how to love it too. Even if that means that it's a love-hate relationship, right? You've got to want to do some research on your guests in order to have a great interview. Now, some podcasters like to send questions ahead of time, but that can mean two different things when you hear that advice or hear that someone does that. One of those things I sometimes do, and one of those things I never do. So the angle on this that I will sometimes take is to ask the guests ahead of time for some simple demographic and general informational questions like, what's your website? Can you provide your social media handles? That kind of thing. Because that information can give you that head start on your own research, pointing you in the right direction of the places they want you to look. But in my not so humble opinion, asking your guests to fill out an entire questionnaire with a ton of questions, especially ones that require a fleshed out answer with a paragraph or whatever, like, in my opinion, not so humble, it's a terrible approach. Don't do it. I don't do it. Okay, listen, I've been on the other side of those ridiculously long questionnaires when I'm approached to be a guest on a show. And I'll tell you exactly the thoughts without pulling any punches that I've had when filling those out. Thought number one, this was supposed to be an interview, not a job application. And thought number two, and speaking of jobs, why am I doing the host job? And truthfully, out of pure annoyance, most of those hosts never get me on. I don't bother. I will try to fill those out when it's a host I'm friendly with and whatnot. But sometimes, honestly, it never happens. And sometimes it's not because I have the reaction you just heard. Sometimes it's purely due to time constraints. Remember, people are busy. And over here on this side of the microphone, mama's busy. So your guests might be really busy too. And they just don't have time to fill out this long, lengthy questionnaire. And they're already setting aside time scheduling the interview with you. And now you want them to set aside more time to do homework ahead of it? Ugh. I'm being serious. And if it sounds callous, it's just honest. Why am I doing the work? Why is your guest doing the work that you as the host, who apparently is very interested in having them on as a guest, doesn't even want to do? It seems like you're sending the wrong message about how much you care about your show. And out of courtesy, the time or two that I have taken the 30 to 40 minutes to fill one of these things out, and then when I'm there for the actual interview, if I can tell that my answers are literally the only resource of information that you're going on, in the middle of the interview, I'm annoyed. Completely honest with you, I'm annoyed. I really feel like, why am I putting in more work than the host is for their show? They want me to do the work. They want me to put in the time, but they wouldn't. And it's their show. And an annoyed guest does not make the best interview. And I am not the only one you're going to be turning off like this if this is your approach. A few questions, good. A lengthy questionnaire with multiple pages where you have to flesh out paragraphs of answers, bad. Okay? If you don't care about your show, and it shows because you're not even doing the work, you're asking the guests to do it all for you and hand it to you on a silver platter. If you don't care about your show, neither will your guests. And honestly, neither will your listeners. Sorry, not sorry. All of that may have sounded harsh. It's probably the harshest you've heard me sound on this show, but it is completely true. Podcasting is fun, but it takes work to be successful. So take your show seriously and do some research yourself. But there are 2 questions that I definitely recommend you ask ahead of time. The first is whether there's anything that they definitely would hope you bring up in the conversation. Maybe they have a book that's coming out, or a course that they're talking about, or there's something about their journey that they're super jazzed to share on your show. And the second question is the opposite question. Is there anything that they definitely would not want you to bring up in the conversation? As an example, and this is a client of mine, she's going through a divorce. So her name publicly is not really her name. So in that case, if she was a guest on a show, she might not want to bring up that she's going through a divorce. So out of courtesy, just ask those 2 questions, because those 2 very simple questions, they'll do 2 very important things to set yourself up for a great interview. Number 1, by asking what they do want to make sure that you cover, you're inviting them to feel comfortable in helping to share what they would like to share on the show. And the second thing is, if you don't want to bring up anything in conversation, that also puts them at ease, because it lets them know that they're not walking into a firing squad or a gotcha kind of interview. And I'll be honest with you, those don't tend to be a lot of fun for the guest. So I'll get into much more of how your prep work helps you perform better as a podcaster over the next couple of episodes, covering interviews in more depth. But those 2 questions can really help set the tone and the table for your guest to feel very, very comfortable pulling up a chair. Okay. But back to the prep talk, or my pep talk for your prep. My prep pep talk. There we go. I like that. My prep pep talk. My bottom line is that unless you are unbelievably seasoned and a regular interviewer who's done it a bunch of times, if you're going to have a good interview, you have to do the prep. So let's go over now what that research and prep work can actually look like. So first, start with the low-hanging fruit. Their website, their social media channels, YouTube videos, that kind of stuff. Look there. Also, have they written a book? If they have, read at least like the back cover, okay? And of course, if you're interviewing them about their book, please put in more work than just reading the back cover. But if they have written a book, that back cover can be a wealth of wonderful information and tidbits that you can bring into the show. Also, if they don't have their own YouTube, or don't do TikTok or Reels on Instagram or whatever, try to track down a video of them. And it's especially good if you can find a past interview with them, because what you're looking for in trying to track down a video is insight on things like their cadence, their tone. And remember, on the last episode, I mentioned that we're going to get into pre-show interviews. And of course, if you do a pre-show interview, you'll get to know their cadence and their tone. But if not, finding a video can be really, really helpful. Also, you want to know how the heck do they pronounce their name? Like, of course, you can always ask, right? But it looks really, really impressive if you found out for yourself because you sourced a video where they say their name. So if you can say it right yourself and you're accurate, a lot of tricky names out there. Oh my gosh, will you win over your guest? Like immediately. So that's step one. Finding places to do the research, finding the resources. And while you're digging into their background and finding all this good info on them, you'll want to organize your questions and conversation points as you anticipate the conversation may flow as you go along. Now, again, what you anticipate may be the conversation flow shouldn't be locked in. Like, you don't want to be too rigid and lock yourself into a specific order for each of your questions. But organizing them in chunks can really help you know when you're in the midst of the interview where your eyeballs should be focusing on for those next couple of questions. And again, in the next couple episodes, we're going to go over how all of this prep translates into the actual craft of the interview. So I'll cover those ins and outs in the next couple episodes, but you do want to organize your questions and conversation points in order to give yourself a general pathway for the conversation. Organized where, Producer Jemmy? I'm so glad you asked. Simply anywhere you want. It can be in a document or a notepad or whatever else is natural and easy and convenient for you. I tend to use either Google Docs, which is what I use for this show, and literally for every other show, I use another tool in the Google Suite arsenal called Sites. And it's a long, drawn-out process of why. It doesn't really matter, but I use that. But Google Docs can work just as great, or any other document that feels comfortable, natural, easy, and convenient for you. And if your show format is that which has your guest interviews following a particular predefined segment format, then put those areas of conversation in your document as your headers. Then, as you go along in your research, fill in those areas underneath each header with the questions that come up for you that apply. And as you read and find out more about your guest, place each question where it best fits. As an example of this, my most recent podcast, the Owl Podcast, examines how you develop your expertise. And the guest conversation is sectioned into 3 parts. The first part is all about them, their expertise, and their overall story. The second segment discusses how much the power of networking has helped propel them forward. And then the third section of the conversation with the guest, we chat about what they've learned from their mentors and how they are mentoring others. So the first thing I do when prepping for that show is I open up my production notes for the episode. It already has the areas of conversation noted as headers. And then as I go through the guest's website, their social media posts, etc., I'll take any question that I think of or topic that I want to bring up in the conversation, and I'll put it under one of those sections, whichever is the most appropriate place for it. That way I feel like I can focus in when I'm talking to the guest about part 1, and then do the same for part 2, and then do the same for part 3. And all I have to do is just scroll up and down the page. But when I first started podcasting 8 years ago, 2014, my first show, Curve the Cube, my interviews weren't super structured to this degree with particular areas of conversation in a set order. But as I researched my guests, areas of interest would start to formulate that I would want to cover. And then I would sort of see some patterns and groupings of questions that might fit. And then I come up with, okay, this is kind of all about their background. And next I also want to make sure there's a part of the conversation that talks about their time that they opened their first gallery or whatever it was. And so I created those customized sections for that show, but the rest of the process was the same. As I went through their information, I filled in more questions, and sometimes the order of those areas of conversation then fluctuated as I kind of fleshed it out even more. And that was a really great approach for me to take as a newbie. Again, not having a set structure ahead of time, but as I'm researching the guests, discovering different areas of conversation I wanted to tap into, and then grouping my questions and topic points into those areas. So I actually recommend that approach for anybody starting out as a new podcaster if you're unsure of how to put together a good flow to your interviews when first getting started, or if you're a podcaster trying to hone your skills. And sometimes another method of comfort for a newbie podcaster is to use a standard set of questions. Now, I don't recommend this for the long haul because it can get old quick, both for you and for your listeners. And you don't want to either A, become stale, or B, become bored, and then C, pod fade. So you don't want to do that. But having a set list of questions you ask every guest can be a very comfortable and simpler way to start as you're getting your feet wet into podcasting. But I don't recommend locking yourself into such a structure for too long. Let yourself, your show, and your audience evolve. But if you're more comfortable starting out than I was, because I had no idea what the heck I was doing, I still advise giving each conversation an anticipated flow. And to be clear, once again, that flow can and likely will change from guest to guest, depending on what works best for you, your guest, your listeners, and that conversation at the time that is actually happening. And there's two other things I want you to be looking for when doing your research. Well, no, actually 3 things. So one thing I just thought of was red flags. Oh my gosh. It is never too late to kill an interview if you've discovered unwanted red flags about your guest, even if that happens after you've recorded, okay? Red flags could be anything in their background that you don't want to align yourself or your brand with. So if anything comes up while you're doing your research, do what's best for your show. Okay, so that's the thing I just thought of. But the other 2 things are super positive and can be very, very powerful if you can find them. One is anything in their background that is more of a unique point of interest, such as awards and industry accolades, or a fun detail about their childhood, or anything else like that. I'm laughing and a little smiling as I'm talking because I just thought of a really great example. Anything particularly interesting about their background is what you should take note of. So I'll share one of my favorite examples. This was years ago. I was interviewing a local reporter here. So she had the tables turned on her. I was interviewing a reporter. And when I was doing research on her, I discovered that she had been named Miss Watermelon of her little town when she was like 17. Okay. So as we're talking, and she is hella accomplished. Like, she has been in the industry for years. She's amazing. So we were going over one of those accomplishments, and I jokingly, passively said, just out of nowhere, I'm like, well, it's nothing like winning Miss Watermelon, but I'm sure you were proud. And she busted out laughing. She laughed so hard because she was caught off guard, number 1, but in a good way. Number 2, she realized, oh my gosh, this woman really did look into me. And also number 3, I brought up a memory for her that was really endearing and positive. So that is a little quick glimpse into one of the episodes that's coming up on how to create really great interview moments. But I wanted to give you an example so you can know what I'm talking about in terms of what can really happen when you try to find a unique point of interest in their background. And the second thing that you want to find are points of relation between your guest and yourself. Do you come from the same hometown? Do you have the same hobby or sports interests? Have kids the same age? Or maybe you have the same favorite food or movie or musician, or maybe you've traveled to some of the same places. And frankly, you can look at this the other way around too. Where do you drastically differ? As long as it doesn't make it weird and awkward and awful. Where do you drastically differ? That can be just as or even more interesting than what you have in common. So take note of all of that. The areas of conversation that start to group together as you're doing your research. And what do you guys have in common? Where do you differ? And what is something in their background that is really unique and interesting? Take note of all of that, and you'll be ready to have a fantastic interview. So I hope that advice has you on the road to becoming an expert interviewer and podcast host. And as a quick mention, be sure that you're monetizing your expertise, whatever that currently is, on the OWL app, spelled with 2 W's and 2 L's. Yes, OWL is the same company behind the new podcast that I'm co-hosting. I'm actually co-hosting it with the founder of the OWL app, my friend Jason Hill. So be sure that you're on the OWL app, and of course, checking out the podcast. But the OWL app is spelled with 2 W's and 2 L's. And the reason I want you on there is because if you're a podcaster, you're probably trying to think about how to monetize what you do. Well, you can have people pick your brain on OWL, but first, guess what they have to pick? Their payment methods. So sign up with my referral code PL954123 and you'll get your $10 credit. And in the upcoming episodes, as I've mentioned a couple of times, I'll continue with discussing guest interviews. First, continuing the Podcasting 101 train in this category by covering conducting the interview, translating all of that prep work into a great interview. And I'll do that in the next episode, episode 51. And then we'll be leveling you up to Podcasting 102, taking a look at creating great interview moments. And that's on episode 52. So if you're not yet subscribed to the show, what are you waiting for? Hit that button. Make sure you do. In the meantime, I have a whole host of free tips for you on my website. Just check out flintstonemedia.com/free tips or watch me to go live on the OWL app, and you can talk to me one-on-one for an impromptu coaching session on whatever your podcasting needs are. So thanks for tuning in for Podcasting Your Brand. In this chapter of the show, I'm revealing how you can harness the power of podcasting to expand your brand. So come and pick up what I've been putting down since 2014. Avoid common mistakes and propel your podcasting and branding forward. And if you have questions or are interested in becoming a sponsoring brand of this show, don't be shy. All you have to do is reach out to me, Jemmy, spelled Jaime, at flintstonemedia.com, and I'll put you in front of all of my podcast listeners. It is producer Jemmy signing off for now. Remember, the only thing more powerful than your voice is your spirit to use it. So turn that mic on.